the Roman army beat everyone. Not occasionally, systematically across centuries, against enemies who had every reason to study what was happening to them. Carthage watched Rome dismantle its Mediterranean empire and rebuild it under Roman administration. Macedon watched the phalanx, the formation that had conquered the known world under Alexander, fold at Cynocephalae and shatter at Pydna. The Seleucid kings, ruling an empire stretching from Syria to Bactria, watched both and kept doing what they had always done. The obvious question is why, and the obvious answer has always been some version of cultural stubbornness, pride, institutional inertia. The idea that these were sophisticated civilizations that somehow couldn't bring themselves to copy what was beating them in the field is a reasonable answer. It fits the evidence on the surface. It even has a certain satisfying logic, the kind of explanation that makes defeated empires look like they deserved what they got. Chapter 1. The army that won every war it fought. That explanation fits the evidence on the surface until you look at what Rome itself did when it was losing. The Romans built their first serious navy in 260 BC. Before that, they had almost no naval capability worth the name. Carthage had dominated the Mediterranean for generations and possessed a fleet that Rome could not match in seamanship, in experience, or in tactical sophistication. So Rome built 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes in response, bolted a boarding bridge called the corvus to the front of each ship, and turned a naval war into a land engagement fought on water. The corvus was 1.2 meters wide and 11 meters long, with a heavy iron spike that dropped into enemy decks and locked the ships together. Roman legionaries then did what Roman legionaries did on land. That is the pattern. Adaptive competence. Rome looked at a problem it could not solve with existing tools, identified what the problem actually required, and built the tool. At Zama in 202 BC, Scipio Africanus used Hannibal's own encirclement tactics against Carthage, the same maneuver Hannibal had used at Cannae 14 years earlier to destroy a Roman army of perhaps 70,000 men. Scipio had studied it, understood the structural logic behind it, and implemented it against its inventor. Carthage lost. When Roman forces finally took Carthage at the end of the Third Punic War, they found more than 2,000 throwing machines inside the city. The Carthaginians had the equipment. They had watched Rome operate for over a century. They had access to the same siege technology. What they could not replicate was the organizational system that deployed it. That detail tends to get lost. The visible Roman military, the formations, the weapons, the engineering, was genuinely visible. Enemies watched it operate in the field. At Cynocephalae in 197 BC, Philip V of Macedon saw the manipular system pull his phalanx apart at the seams. The manipular gaps drew hoplites forward, broke their rigid line, surrounded the fragments, and turned a formation that had conquered Persia into a killing ground. At Pydna in 168 BC, Perseus watched the same thing happen to him on broken terrain, where the sarissa, all 21 feet of it, became a liability the moment the ground stopped being flat. Greek military writers documented the mechanism. Polybius explained exactly why the phalanx lost. The analysis was available in writing to anyone who could read. So the assumption is not unreasonable. The Roman method was observable. It was documented. It kept winning against opponents who were watching it win. And Rome itself had proved that copying worked. It had done exactly that repeatedly against exactly these kinds of opponents. The army that beat Macedon at Pydna was itself a copy of a Samnite innovation, refined over a century of Italian warfare. Rome abandoned the phalanx after the humiliation at Caudine Forks in 321 BC and came back with a formation it had taken from the people who beat it. If Rome could copy, the question of why nobody copied Rome becomes genuinely hard to answer. But the question contains a hidden premise, and the hidden premise is doing all the work. Chapter 2. What Rome copied and when. Rome was not precious about borrowing. A Roman source says it plainly. Their ancestors never lacked wisdom or courage, and they were never too proud to take over a good idea from another country. The record backs this up. The manipular formation came from the Samnites. The encirclement at Zama came from Hannibal. After Caere in 53 BC, where Parthian cavalry destroyed the army of Crassus in the Syrian desert, killing or capturing roughly 30,000 men, Rome spent the next 2 centuries reorganizing its approach to heavy cavalry. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, Roman heavy cavalry units called clibanarii were operating across the eastern frontier. The word itself derives from a Persian term for neck guard wearer. Rome didn't just copy the tactic, it borrowed the name. This is the fact the standard account holds up as proof that military imitation was available to anyone willing to do it. And on the surface, it works. Rome observed a superior method, recognized it as superior, and implemented it. Why couldn't Macedon do the same thing in reverse? But look at what Rome actually copied, and when, and under what conditions. The Samnite manipular system was absorbed during the Second Samnite War, after 321 BC, into an army that already had a developed levy system, an officer structure capable of training soldiers in new formations, and a political system that could mandate the change across multiple legions simultaneously. Scipio's implementation of Hannibal's encirclement tactics at Zama required a Roman command structure flexible enough to execute coordinated cavalry flanking movements, a structure that existed before Scipio arrived. The clibanarii units of the late Empire were grafted onto a professional army that already had the recruitment infrastructure, the service contracts, and the institutional continuity to train and maintain heavy cavalry at scale. Rome never copied a military system. Rome copied specific techniques into a system it already possessed. That distinction is the one the assumption erases. When a state with developed institutional infrastructure observes a superior tactic, it can absorb it, because the infrastructure required to implement the tactic already exists. When a state without that infrastructure observes the same tactic, it sees the surface. It does not see the organization underneath that makes the surface work. The Romans knew this, at some level. After Cannae, the worst defeat in Roman history, catastrophic losses in a single afternoon, Rome did not copy Hannibal's army. It absorbed the lesson of what Hannibal had done and waited. Waited for Scipio. Waited for the right commander to implement the right response using the existing Roman system. The response, when it came, was Roman. It used Roman legions, Roman discipline, Roman logistics. It borrowed Hannibal's geometry and executed it through Roman institutions, which raises the question that the assumption cannot quite formulate. When Macedon watched the manipular system dismantle its phalanx at Pydna, what exactly would copying have required? Not the observation, not even the will. Something else. Something the battlefield did not show and Polybius did not write down. Something that was operating inside the Roman army every day for decades before the battle began, and would have to operate inside any army that wanted to produce the same result. What that something was is where the standard account stops looking. Chapter 3. Pydna, 168 BC. The lesson nobody learned. June 168 BC. The Roman consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus faced Perseus of Macedon on a coastal plain near the Aegean. The Macedonian phalanx was, on flat ground, nearly impenetrable. The sarissa, 21 feet of weighted pike, created a wall of overlapping points that Roman legionaries could not cut through from the front. Ancient sources record that Paulus, watching the Macedonian line advance, observed a formation that had conquered Persia. This was not a rabble. This was the formation that had conquered Persia. Then the ground changed. The Macedonian advance crossed uneven terrain, and the rigid phalanx, which required every man in precise lateral contact with the men beside him, began to open gaps. Roman maniples pushed into those gaps. The sarissa, designed for a flat killing ground, became unmanageable in close quarters. Roman swords, short and designed for exactly this kind of fractured individual combat, did the rest. Macedonian losses were severe. Perseus fled. Rome organized Macedonia as a province. The tactical lesson was not subtle. The phalanx required flat ground and rigid formation integrity. The manipular system was designed to fracture and surround. On anything but perfect terrain, the outcome was not in question. Polybius, a Greek historian writing in Rome, with access to Roman commanders and Macedonian survivors, documented the mechanism in precise analytical terms. He identified exactly why the phalanx lost, and exactly what the manipular system did that the phalanx could not answer. His work circulated. Hellenistic commanders read it. But the Seleucid Empire continued fielding Macedonian-style phalanxes. Successor kingdoms that had watched Rome dismantle Macedon in 2 engagements separated by 30 years kept the formation that had lost both times. The core of every Seleucid army remained what it had always been. Macedonian hereditary soldiers from military settlements scattered across the empire, men whose families had been military settlers for generations, trained in the phalanx because their fathers were trained in the phalanx and their fathers before them. This is where the assumption reaches its most persuasive point. Here is observable tactical failure. Here is documented analysis explaining the failure. Here are wealthy, literate, administratively sophisticated kingdoms with every apparent resource needed to respond. And here is the response. Nothing. Not reform, not experiment, not even a documented debate about whether the phalanx should be reconsidered. The standard account calls this stubbornness, cultural attachment to a Macedonian military identity, the prestige of Alexander's formation, making rational reform politically impossible, and that explanation is not wrong exactly. It just stops too early. Because stubbornness is a description, it is not a mechanism. It tells you what happened. These kingdoms kept doing what they had always done, without telling you why changing what they had always done was not in fact the straightforward rational option the assumption implies. The assumption treats military reform as a decision. Show up at Pydna, watch the phalanx collapse, go home and retrain your army in manipulative tactics. What that framing leaves out is everything that would have had to exist before the retraining could begin. Chapter 4. 59 centurions. Every Roman legion had between 59 and 60 centurions, not generals, not aristocrats with family connections to the Senate, officers promoted from the ranks, or drawn from the class just below the equestrian order, who had demonstrated over years of service that they could train men, maintain discipline, and issue commands under pressure in the field. Each one commanded a century of approximately 80 soldiers. Each one was personally responsible for the fighting capability of those men, their training, their equipment, their readiness, their conduct. The centurionate was not a rank. It was an institution. Centurion pay ran at 15 to 20 times the rate of a common legionary, depending on the period and the seniority of the position. That differential was not arbitrary. It reflected what the centurionate actually was. A professional career structure that made it economically rational for capable men from non-aristocratic backgrounds to spend their working lives inside the army, accumulating expertise that could not be acquired any other way. A legion's senior centurion, the primus pilus, finished his 25 years and was eligible for appointment as camp prefect, prefectus castrorum, third in command of the entire legion, outranking tribunes who came from families that outranked him socially in every other context. The camp prefect was, by definition, a man who had spent a quarter-century inside the Roman military system. His institutional memory was the legion's institutional memory. He remembered how the unit had trained under the previous legate. He knew which tactical problems had been solved before and how. He was the connective tissue between what the legion had been and what it currently was, and when he was replaced, his replacement came from the same pipeline, carrying the same depth of accumulated experience. This is what a battlefield observer could not see. Watch a Roman legion defeat a Macedonian phalanx and you see the maniples, the gaps, the swords. You do not see the centurion who has spent 11 years drilling his century in exactly the kind of fractured close-quarters combat that Pydna required. You do not see the promotion system that put him there, or the pay structure that kept him there, or the political and legal infrastructure that made the entire pyramid stable across decades. You see the output. The institution that produced the output is invisible from the outside. No Hellenistic kingdom had anything structurally equivalent. The successor armies ran on hereditary military settlers, men who were soldiers because their fathers had been soldiers, trained in the phalanx because that was the formation their settlement was organized around. There was no promotion pathway from the ranks to a professional officer corps. There was no economic incentive structure that made a career inside the army more rational than a career outside it, for a capable man of modest means. There was no mechanism for accumulating and transmitting institutional knowledge across generations of soldiers, because the institution that would have transmitted it did not exist. To copy the centurionate, a Hellenistic kingdom would have had to build it from nothing. Identify candidates, create a promotion pathway, construct a pay differential that made the career viable. Wait, and this is the part the assumption never accounts for. The 20 to 30 years it would take for the first generation of centurions to accumulate enough experience to actually function as the institution requires. A decision made the day after Pydna would have produced its first trained centurionate, approximately when Rome was finishing the destruction of Corinth in 146 BC, by which point the question of Hellenistic military reform would have been entirely academic. Chapter 5. 25 years. Before Augustus, the Roman army was not what most people picture when they picture the Roman army. In the Republic, there was no standing professional force. The levy was annual, held at the start of each campaigning season, in years when war was declared, drawing men from the adult male citizen population according to property qualifications that shifted over time. 11,000 asses initially, reduced to 4,000 around 213 BC as the manpower demands of the Hannibalic War stretched the eligible pool, down to 1,500 by 123 BC as Rome's Italian wars continued to drain the class of smallholding citizens the levy depended on. The army that beat Macedon at Cynocephalae and Pydna was not a professional standing force. It was a levy army, men called up for a campaign, discharged when it ended, called up again the following year if war continued. Augustus changed this. He fixed service terms at 16 years active and 4 in reserve, later standardized to 20 years plus 5. Soldiers who completed their term received land or a cash pension on discharge. The army became, for the first time, a career, a structured working life with a defined endpoint and a guaranteed reward for reaching it. For men without property, without connections, without prospects in the civilian economy, it was the most stable offer available. This is the version of the Roman army that tends to dominate the popular image, the professional legionary, 25 years of continuous service, daily training that Josephus described as bloodless battles and battles as bloody training. Vegetius, writing in the late 4th century, documented a training regimen that included marching 20 Roman miles, roughly 18.4 modern miles, in 5 hours during summer months, weapons drill with implements twice the weight of actual equipment, and continuous exercise for veterans as well as recruits, every day, without exception. But here is the ambiguity the standard account passes over. If the professional standing army was an Augustan reform, then the army that destroyed the Hellenistic world, at Cynocephalae, at Pydna, at Magnesia, was not yet that army. The Republic's legions were annual levies, not career professionals, which means the military system that rival states were watching and failing to copy was itself still developing into its most formidable form. The enemies who failed to respond to Roman dominance in the 2nd century BC were failing to copy something that Rome had not yet fully built. What they were failing to copy then was not the Augustan professional machine. It was something more fundamental, the accumulated weight of the centurionate, the tactical flexibility of the manipular system, and the logistical and allied infrastructure that made sustained campaigning possible, even with an annually reconstituted army. The professional service term, when it came, didn't create Roman military dominance. It deepened and systematized something that was already structurally present. And that makes the copying problem harder, not easier, because it means there was no single moment when a rival state could have looked at Rome and seen a finished system to replicate. What they were watching was an institution in continuous development, adding capability, absorbing lessons, adjusting its recruitment base, across 4 centuries of Italian and Mediterranean warfare. The service contract was the visible surface of that development. The thing underneath it was older and less visible, and had been accumulating since before the manipular formation existed. 25 years in uniform produces a soldier that an annual levy cannot. But 25 years of institutional development produces something that 25 years of individual service cannot account for on its own. And it is that second accumulation, organizational not personal, that no rival state had the time, the political structure, or the economic base to replicate, even if they had understood precisely what they were looking at. Most of them didn't understand what they were looking at. Chapter 6. The tax that built the legion, and the one state that tried to build it too. In 493 BC, Rome signed a treaty with the Latin city-states called the Foedus Cassianum. The terms were straightforward. Each party would provide an equal force for joint campaigns, under unified command, with spoils divided proportionally. On paper, it was a military alliance. In practice, it was something more consequential, a mechanism for doubling Roman military potential without doubling Roman expenditure, formalized in law and enforceable across generations. That treaty is 400 years older than the professional army Augustus created. By the time Rome was fighting Macedon, the Allied contribution system had been operating and expanding for 2 centuries. Allied states supplied not just men, but equipment, grain, and ships, the full logistical substrate of sustained campaigning. Rome maintained, as one source puts it, a centralized command and line of supply, expert engineers, and effective diplomacy through a network of allies that stretched across the Italian peninsula and into the broader Mediterranean. When Rome lost ships at sea, it could replace them. When it lost men at Cannae, losses Roman sources recorded as among the worst in the Republic's history, it reconstituted its armies and kept fighting. Carthage, which won Cannae, could not absorb equivalent losses. The system behind the Roman army was more durable than the army itself. The road network tells the same story in stone. By the 1st century of the empire, 30 military highways ran out from Rome, connecting to nearly 400 roads across the territory. Legions could march 35 to 40 kilometers per day along them. Supply lines functioned across distances that would have paralyzed armies dependent on slower, less organized logistics. The roads were not built for trade, though trade used them. They were built for military movement and military communication, a capital investment in sustained operational reach that had been accumulating since the 4th century BC. No rival state had anything equivalent, not because the concept was unavailable, roads are not a Roman invention, but because the political and administrative structure required to build them, maintain them, and use them as a military system took centuries to construct, and required a specific kind of relationship between Rome and its subordinate allies that no Hellenistic kingdom had developed. The Seleucid Empire was vast. It was also administratively fragmented, dependent on satraps whose loyalty was contingent and whose logistical contribution to central military campaigns was unreliable. The Macedonian kingdoms ran on hereditary military settlers who supplied themselves from their land grants. The Allied contribution system, continuous, legally enforced, administratively tracked, was a Roman political achievement, not a military one. This is where the copying problem becomes structural in a way the assumption cannot absorb. To copy the Roman army, a rival state would have needed the centurionate, it would have needed the service contract, and it would have needed the economic base, the tax infrastructure, the Allied treaty network, the road system, that made continuous professional military service financially possible in the first place. One rival state understood this structural problem better than any other. The results were real. Sassanid heavy infantry arrived on battlefields in large rectangular shields and heavy mail armour, a description that comes from Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman officer writing from direct observation, not from Sassanid propaganda. The Dalam provinces in the southern Caspian region produced soldiers that contemporaries recognized as a distinct and formidable type. Mountain infantry, hard-charging, equipped with swords, maces, axes, and javelins. 4,000 of them were resettled to Ctesiphon, the Sassanid capital, as an elite guard formation called the Gondi-Shahanshah. These were not levied peasants. These were professional soldiers maintained at the centre of the empire, available for deployment without the delays of seasonal recruitment. Procopius, the Byzantine historian, called Sassanid infantry a crowd of pitiable peasants who come into battle for no other purpose than to dig through walls and despoil the slain. But Procopius was a Roman writing about an enemy, and modern historians have noted that his characterization reflects a literary tradition of Roman contempt for Eastern infantry, rather than accurate battlefield assessment. The Sassanid army that fought Rome to strategic exhaustion across the 6th and 7th centuries, leaving both empires so militarily depleted that Arab armies conquered them within a generation of each other, was not an army of pitiable peasants. And yet the gap remained. The Sassanids significantly improved on the poor infantry tradition of their Parthian predecessors. They never matched the quality of contemporary Roman legionaries. The sources that damn them most harshly are Roman sources with an interest in the damning. But even accounting for that bias, the tactical convergence between Rome and Persia across 3 centuries produced a military standoff, not a Sassanid victory. 2 empires that began with radically different military systems ended by the late 6th century, fighting each other to exhaustion with armies that had grown to resemble each other. Similar, evenly matched. Neither one having solved the problem the other represented. Here is what that convergence actually shows. The Sassanids copied everything that was copyable. Tactics? Yes. Equipment? Yes. Formation structure and partially. Siege technology? Yes. elite professional units maintained at the capital. Yes. What they did not copy, because it could not be copied by any act of political will, was the centurionate, the 25-year service contract and the Allied tax infrastructure. The Sassanid military remained, at its structural core, a cavalry-dominant force that had grafted improved infantry onto a system that was not built around infantry. The graft took. It produced real capability. It did not produce Roman legionaries, because Roman legionaries were not produced by tactics or equipment or even by professional pay alone. They were produced by an institution, a specific social mechanism for recruiting, training, promoting and retaining military expertise across generations, that the Sassanids had no equivalent of and no pathway to building. What the Sassanid case proves, more cleanly than any other, is that the thing being copied was not what it appeared to be from the outside. Chapter 7. The Verdict. The question was never why Rome's enemies refused to copy the Roman army. Refusal implies a choice was available. It wasn't. What rivals observed on battlefields at Cynocephalae, at Pydna, at every engagement where the manipular system dismantled whatever came at it, was a military output. Formations moving with coordinated flexibility. Officers issuing commands that were obeyed with precision under pressure. Soldiers who fought in fragmented close-quarters chaos as though they had rehearsed it, because they had every day for years. What rivals could not observe was the institution that produced that output, because institutions are not visible on battlefields. They are visible only in the daily administrative life of the organization that runs them, accumulated across decades, embedded in promotion pathways and pay structures and legal contracts and treaty obligations that predate the battle being watched by a century or more. The centurionate could not be copied because building it required 20 to 30 years before the first generation of officers had accumulated enough experience to function as the institution demands, and the political will to begin that process would have produced its first usable results roughly when Rome was finishing the destruction of Corinth. The service contract could not be copied because enforcing 25 years of military obligation required a legal and administrative system that took Rome centuries of political development to construct, and that no Hellenistic kingdom possessed or could construct on a timeline that mattered. The Allied tax infrastructure could not be copied because it was not a policy. It was 4 centuries of treaty relationships, road construction, administrative capacity, and political enforcement that Rome had been building since 493 BC, longer than most of its rivals had existed in their current form. The Sassanids tried hardest and got closest. They copied tactics, equipment, siege technology, and created professional elite units at the capital. The gap between what they built and what Rome fielded is precisely the gap between copying the surface and possessing the institution. Better infantry, not Roman infantry. The distinction is the verdict. Rival states did not fail to copy the Roman army because they were proud, or culturally rigid, or strategically obtuse. They failed because the Roman army's decisive advantages were not located in the parts of the system that were visible from the outside. The manipular formation was visible, the centurionate was not. The gladius and pilum were visible. The 25-year service contract and the promotion pathway that made a career inside the army economically rational for capable men of modest means were not. The battle formations were visible. The 4 centuries of Allied treaty infrastructure that funded continuous professional service were not. You cannot copy what you cannot see. Chapter 8. The province that watched and did nothing. After Pydna, Macedonia became a Roman province. Roman governors administered it. Roman officials ran its taxation, its courts, its public infrastructure. Roman legions were stationed on its territory. The Macedonian military class, the descendants of the hereditary settlers who had fought at Pydna, whose grandfathers had fought at Cynocephalae, whose military identity stretched back to Alexander, lived inside the Roman system for decades, not observing it from across a battlefield, living inside it, and they did not copy it. This is the detail the reframe cannot fully absorb. Macedonia after 168 BC is a different case. The Macedonians were not watching from outside. They had Roman governors explaining Roman administration to them. They had Roman officers present on their territory. They had, if they wanted it, the closest possible view of how the Roman system actually operated day to day. The research points toward one answer. The hereditary military settlers, families trained in phalanx warfare for generations, whose social identity and land tenure were organized around a specific military function, could not retrain without dismantling the social structure that produced soldiers in the first place. Path dependency, the research calls it. Families trained in the phalanx because their fathers were trained in the phalanx, and changing that required not a military reform but a social reorganization so total it would have destroyed the class of people capable of carrying it out. But that answer, precise as it is, raises something the research leaves open. The Roman system's most decisive feature, the centurionate, the institutional transmission of military expertise across generations of officers, was operating inside Macedonia during the provincial period. Roman centurions were present. Their function was observable not just in battle, but in the daily administrative and training life of the units stationed there. And still nothing transferred. Not the promotion structure, not the service contract, not the tactical unit organization. Nothing that was invisible on a battlefield became visible through decades of proximity, which means the thing being transmitted through the centurionate and the 25-year service cycle was not, in the end, a set of practices that could be observed and recorded and implemented. It was something that could only be produced by the institution itself, something that existed in the relationship between the system and the people it had been forming since before they enlisted, and that could not be extracted from that relationship and handed to someone standing next to it. Macedonia had the best possible view of the Roman military machine, closer than Carthage ever got, closer than the Sassanids, closer than any external rival at any point in Roman history, and the Macedonians, watching Roman centurions train Roman soldiers on Macedonian soil, still could not reproduce what they were watching. What exactly was it that they couldn't see?